I go on the broom. Hello, Ijuma. Hello, Isella.
Hello.
So today we're going to talk about having the talk. Ijuma started this conversation with Isella and I in a class that we're taking with her about how to talk to someone about how something they did or said was racist without it quickly becoming, I said you were a racist. And maybe you are, maybe you're not. We're going to talk about that too. So before we start in with having the talk, let's start with grounding ourselves today, Isella, and then Ijuma. Let's think about which of our community agreements we'd like to focus on. All right, Isella.
I think for today, I want to focus on the breath. I was just writing something up recently where, there's so many benefits to that deep belly breathing that I think sometimes we take for granted, or we kind of think it's not a big deal. We're like, oh no, I'm okay. I don't need to take a deep breath. Or we get so off kilter, then we go, okay, that's where I need to take the breath. But that taking that deep breath, even before you say something, can really, really be super powerful to help you become more present. Sometimes we're triggered and we go to an old story and we're pulling that old story in as we react in a situation. So that deep breath helps us get more present. And I had a teacher say to me, when you take that very deep breath and your count in the inhale is longer than the exhale, it's for energy. It's to energize yourself. But if you inhale and then you exhale at a longer count than the inhale, it's a grounding experience. And that was really interesting because I hadn't heard it that way. And so just a reminder as we're moving through this, if you're feeling like you're needing to just take a moment to gather and become present instead of pulling in your old story and your experiences, take that longer breath and in the exhale.
On the exhale. Okay. Yeah. Longer on the exhale.
Can we do it together?
Yeah, let's do it.
I love that.
I have my hands on my belly. No one knows that, but that's where I put it. And with children, when I do this, I put like little toys or stuffed animals or something to help them see the elevation. And I think even with grownups who are used to that shallow breath, they think that when they're taking a deep breath and they're doing it from here, it's enough, and it isn't. Some folks who don't do yoga or don't do that kind of deep breathing don't know that. So it's important that you've got to get the air all the way down to your belly. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a deep inhale. Hold it for 1, 2, 3, and exhale. I typically will do 3, especially even when I'm moving between classrooms. If I'm doing observations and being in classrooms, sometimes I have to do that to get recentered.
Thank you, Isella.
Yeah, thank you.
I felt like I needed that grounding. Yeah. Thinking about what community agreements I wanted to focus on, I'm thinking about restorative justice, thinking about that in these conversations about talking about race, talking about racism, calling people to account, and thinking that we're all human, we all make mistakes. And because we're in communities and because we want to talk about people's impact versus just their intention, and we want to be in community where people are held accountable, because no one wants to be harmful on purpose. Like, I believe in the good of people. And so people make mistakes. And in that mistake making, we're not trying to shame or belittle or push them out. Like, there's no suspension in transformative talk. Like, no one's going to get kicked out for saying the wrong thing. But we are going to hold people accountable and help people, support people in making amends. So as you're grounded and you're breathing, remember that even if you've done something like one of the stories that we tell, you're not a bad person. That doesn't mean you can't be part of our community. That doesn't mean you can't keep learning. that as a community, we're going to restore the relationship that's been broken by the racial harm that's been caused.
And so, Ijuma, while you're going, do you want to set the stage for, I mentioned the three of us are in Isella and I are in a class that you're facilitating, and this topic came up. And so maybe for those who haven't heard of the talk or the slippery slope, maybe just restate the context, and then we can pull out some examples.
Mm-hmm. So the idea around when someone says that they're racist, a lot of times, especially in white dominant culture, thinking about, oh, that's a mistake, we want to punish it. So we're going to shame that person and say, well, you're racist and you shouldn't say that, right? But we don't want to argue about who people are because we don't know, like in the video it says, we don't know what's inside people's hearts, right? And you can't actually argue with that. So when someone says or does something racist, you want to talk about the impact that it had, right? That the thing that you did was harmful because of X, Y, and Z. And that's what makes it racist. And not get in the back and forth about, am I racist or not racist? Even though like that's going to come up, but don't fall for it. Like it's just a distraction or a trick. So today we're going to talk about it coming up in professional development, thinking about other forms of oppression that comes up, talking about cultural differences, but we want to start practicing not focusing on trying to shame or label someone as racist, that we want to focus on the impact that it has, that racist behavior, that racist action. And what's the impact? And call people to account to fix it.
Okay. So what would be helpful, Isella, did anything come up for you during class that you were thinking about in your own work? Do you want me to give an example? Like, where should we go from here?
I think that just initially, as Ijuma was talking, how quickly it goes to that place, right?
Mm-hmm.
How quickly something happens on media. Somebody says something, did something, they pull up an old tape of something that happened 20 years ago and immediately goes right to, you are a racist, right? And we get lost in the story of that instead of really looking at the impact. And as we were in class, what came up for me is I kind of have my life is like in chapters. I don't know if anybody else's life is like that, but I have like the chapter where I lived in Texas, the chapter where I lived in Germany, like the chapter that I did this work. So these chapters. And I was thinking about just that question of when someone says something that's racist. I went back to when I first was an administrator, and I was like 24 years old, and I was at a director at a treatment center, residential treatment center of the children's program. And women came to treatment with up to 3 children up to the age of 12. We were sort of in the Bible Belt of Texas, which in itself was a very new experience for me. But I was 24. And so everyone was twice my age. And so I thought about this kind of conversation in where I really felt, and I couldn't always put my finger on it, but I felt that I felt it more than I could identify it. And I was also 24. So at that point in my life and where I am now, I think about how this conversation might be different, or how someone younger might have a challenge, might feel challenged by having these difficult conversations. So that's kind of what I thought about, thinking about what I would have said then and what I would have said now, even if I was given all of the tools and the approaches.
So that's interesting in the sense of like, what would we say if let's just for right now say we're doing professional development and somebody of the participants or a colleague or somebody outside of us says or does something that's racist. Sorry for the construction, I'll mute myself. Or the other side too is if somebody calls us out. Which one would you like to hit first? Because what you just said there, Isella, made me think of both sides of that coin. You could have heard or felt something, but you could also be told by somebody that something you did was.
So I think, like when Isellas talking about being younger, and a lot of times we don't always have the language, and we don't get that language until later. That's not my experience. Like at 24, I had already been in practice and already had language around what is racism, what's racist, how to talk to people. But what was different from then to now is that now I feel more confident and now I feel more protected than when I was younger. Like it wasn't really safe because like who's gonna listen to this young Black girl
Right.
push against the status quo and say, well, hey, that's racist, that's unfair, that's not right, and it needs to stop. Right now, I have a little bit more age and expertise around it. But I think being younger or having less experience, that even in that place, that we want to support ourselves. And it doesn't matter, even if you're like 50 years old and you're just learning about that, that's cool too. But I think it's important to start having language around it because a lot of people do just feel in their feelings like this isn't right. This feels wrong and harmful, but I'm not sure what to say. And one of the ways that we can maybe know and build our language is actually being in community. Because one of the things that I had when I was younger was community and mentors, right? So even when that feeling came up and I'm like, did something racist just happen? I had people to go to say, hey, this is what happened, and I need to process it and think of ways to go back and address it. And so having community is like, this isn't individual work, right? This is always collective work. We always have to be working in the collective. So if something you're unsure about happens and like it seems racist, it probably is racist because we live in a white supremacist society. So we're always going to start from that point. And being in community and having someone that you trust and that's safe, but you don't want to go to the person like, well, maybe that wasn't it. Maybe they didn't mean it. That's not the person. Like you find community, find someone else. But we want to be in community so we can start to have language, that we can have support to actually talk about race and racism and to hold people account.
I think in this day and age, it's easier to connect because like we're connected, right? We're in community and we can have these kinds of conversations. So I would say to anyone who's watching that, I mean, this was, 30 years ago. So
Right.
we didn't have the internet the way that we do now. I mean, we had email, basic website kind of stuff.
There's that.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And so you don't know how many times I was told, oh, I thought you were a client. And it was just a weird, I'm like, okay. But I knew that it was coming more from the race part, that I looked more like the clients than I did the people who work there.
And that understanding that that racial hierarchy, because white people don't have drug problems, right? Good, nice white people from middle class backgrounds, they don't have that. All those drug problems, that's for people that have brown skin, or that's for people that are not white. So of course you would be the client and not the person that has authority and power in this situation. And so like, yes, that's racist. And that's when we talk about microaggression, that's what we're talking about. Like those assumptions of stereotypes that are based in racism.
So I think that developing that language is such a critical part of this. And as you mentioned, reaching out and creating that community for yourself.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to what you both were just sort of saying. I got like so many thoughts in my head, and while they're not digging, I'm going to say it as quickly as I can. So you both said it feels in your gut like it's racist, sexist, ableist. Did I do age already? Whatever. At what point do you go, I know this is, or do you just bring it up even if you're not sure? Does that make sense? If you're going to have the talk with someone and you're not quite sure if even what they said or did was racist, ableist, sexist, do you still have the talk?
I would say yes. So you're the expert of your own experience, right? So a lot of times we try to legalize it and like racism is just this thing in this box. But like my own experience and my own lived experience tells me that what's happening, like in my gut, like what's happening, I can talk to people about that. Like this was harmful to me. This felt harmful when you said that you thought I was a client. Because that, to me, what that brings up is assuming that only Black and brown people can be drug addicts and have or that have, that are
Addiction.
working through their addictions.
Right.
Sorry, I was looking for the language, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what you can talk about. And you don't have, and you, and the idea is you're not trying to convince that person what they did was racist. What you are confident and you stand in is what's been your experience and the harm that it's caused. And that's what you talk about.
So the language that I often use now is I'd like to have a conversation just about that right there. So like in that moment, if you can't always, because, it's something that needs to happen another time.
Right.
But that right there that was just said, or even the tone of that, I'd like to talk about that for a moment, because within me, there's an undercurrent of superiority or an undercurrent of where it just doesn't feel or sit right with me. Can we have a conversation about that? Because I'm feeling a bit uncomfortable right now. So it's like now I have a little bit more language. I'm a little bit more assertive, and I'm not like the young kid around the block. And so that comes more natural. But what's interesting is I asked my husband, who's Black, and I said to him last night when I was reading the email about our topic today, I said, when someone says something racist to you, what do you say? He's like, not a damn thing. And I'm like, you're no help, Kevin. I said, you need to start these classes.
Right? Because that's not everybody's role, right?
Right.
So everybody, like if I choose to play this role,
Right.
but it's not for every Black person to like rank up, because you would be spending all your time like I do, ranking up and talking about people being racist. Kevin wants to like be a dad and and work on cars, play basketball, right? Because it takes up so much emotional labor.
Right.
And a lot of people just opt out. Like, I don't say nothing. Like, I know white people are racist. That's what my grandpa would say. He's like, I know white people are racist. And yeah. And so the other piece around that is not just individual, even though we're talking about interpersonal racism, that the institution actually supports that.
Right.
The institution, how we're educated, the images that we see, how we're surrounded, young children watching how other people interact, that the institution actually supports people holding these stereotypes and makes it okay for people to say those racist things. And also be in denial of it, right?
Right.
Because the system also says that, oh, well, they didn't mean it, or they're a good person. And so that's the message people get over and over. And so a lot of times, it's not, I said this in the class last week, like this isn't like a magic potion or wand, right? People are going to be defensive more, like 90% of the time. People are going to be in denial. They'll distract. They'll say, you're the real racist. That's not what happened. That's not what I intended. I thought we were friends. I don't know why you would bring this up to me. Right? So like those are the things.
My favorite is, but I have Black grandbabies.
Right. Talk about proximity to Black people and other people of color, right? Like people go through that denial and that defensiveness. And I think like that's where a lot of people are. Because like, yeah, okay, I can go and I can, call out racism. And then they're like, oh, this person was very defensive, so I don't know what to do right now. And that happens a lot in thinking about, in my experience, a lot of white people, like when they come to this realization, like, oh yes, I should be speaking up about racism, but they do it from a very white dominant perspective, and they call out and they'll like call other white people racist. They'll try to shame them. And then when that person becomes defensive, then they're like, oh, I don't know what else to do. Because like I told them, and then they were like, well, no, that's not what I meant. And now I don't know what to do. So I guess I don't do anything else. And they walk away from it, or they leave it for other people to deal with.
It's so loud here, y'all would die. So I totally get it, like in Isellas' example, where the harm was to her. Let's go back to the white people. If they want to do it not in line with the white dominant culture and the shaming and the blaming, it's not their experience. They weren't harmed, but they felt it in their gut that what was said in that group with a bunch of other white people was a racist remark. Do you see it? Can you talk a little bit about that for a second? And maybe I'll give you the quick one is, let's say we're at professional development and someone says, oh, we can't talk about that. Our legislator doesn't agree with it. We're getting federal dollars. And so we can't talk about racism or the white supremacy. People might feel bad. What's on me to say in return?
Did you want to say something? Yeah, I can go. Like I was talking a lot. I think a couple of things that if you're committed to anti-racist work, then that means that you know that, again, institutional racism is a thing, and so the institutions are going to say, well, we don't feel comfortable, we don't like you talking about that, maybe not say those words, right? Because white supremacy is going to try to control the narrative. But part of being anti-racist is to push back about that. And I think there's been a lot of threats around taking away funding when we explicitly talk about race and racism. And a lot of times, like, that money is already secured. So like the present money actually isn't going to be affected. So you're worrying about maybe future money that's going to be affected. And so just be honest with that. And part of, if you're committed to this, don't use other people as an excuse, right? Because I'm asking, what did you say back to them? Like, did you talk to that legislator and talk about, well, we're committed to anti-racist work, and so we're going to use accurate language to talk about this and be truthful. So are you asking me not to be truthful? Or are you worried about hurting white people's feelings? Because that's actually not our concern. Like, white people are going to be fine either way, because we still live in a white supremacist society. And so part of our work, like especially we're working with children and working with other adults, is that we're working in an anti-racist way. And so we're going to use the language. We're going to talk about whiteness. We're going to talk about white dominant culture. We're going to name white supremacy. And that isn't we're not talking about it just to blame individual white people, right? We're talking about the institutional racism. And so that's what we're supposed to address. We're talking about institutional racism in education. And so it's your responsibility to speak up and to push back and not use that as an excuse. Because that tells me that you actually weren't committed to that when it gets a little bit uncomfortable. And part of our work is remember that you don't have a right to comfort. Like, that's what white dominant culture says. That white people have a right to comfort and to feel good and, their white saviorism, but they don't actually have to be accountable. And that's what we're asking the institutions to be, and to stop harm.
I think one of the things that really hit home when you were talking, Ijma, is that be honest part.
Mm-hmm.
And this is outside of this conversation, but so many times I have heard folks use the higher ups, the administrators, the rules are this. They said we're not able to. And until we are willing to say, show me where it says that and tell me what the implications of that are, tell me whether that's really true about funding or not funding, because I know in just childcare programs in themselves, so many times they're like, oh, licensing says, or our credit, there ain't nothing about that and nobody's licensing. Like, show me that. And so we need to be willing to get honest about what within me is, like what's happening within me, because oftentimes when people come from that place of, oh, we can't for these reasons, that's really about something going on inside of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we have to be honest about those, right? About your discomfort.
Yep.
So in that moment, Ijuma, in particular, when you were saying it, there's sort of, I have a responsibility as the person who's being hired to do the PD. There's also the other white people, meaning the people that have the fear of losing or saying it's the higher ups. Like, there were multiple people there that need to be committed to the anti-racist work.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And be honest, because if that's not what you want to do, then you're actually not committed to anti-racist work.
Right.
Right. Like, you just like to say, diversity, equity, inclusion. Right. But if that's not based in anti-racism, if that's not actually based in anti-ableism, anti-transphobia, then you're not actually doing the work. It's just performative. It's just like those three words sound nice together. We can do good marketing about it, but we're about the work, because the system that we're in right now is doing harm. When we think about preschool suspensions, when we think about who gets hired and who gets promoted, when we look at the leadership of ECE, it's still predominantly white women.
Right.
Right. When we think about who holds the power, and our anti-racist work is to create equity, that power is shared.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that is to, go ahead, Isella.
No, I just think but so often it's a box that we check,
Mm-hmm.
right? We check the box. We've done the work. No, you haven't. You haven't done the work. You
just showed up for a meeting.
Right. Right. It's just like SEL too. It's like, we'll buy a program, we'll implement a few of these things, and we say we've done it. No, you haven't. Because the work means that the work is hard and uncomfortable. And there has to be a commitment, because if you don't make that commitment, it'll be the thing that we did. And that was fun, wasn't it?
Mm-hmm. Like, so one of the outcomes is that we look at systemic change, right? Not just like, now everybody feels good, kumbaya, but how did the system change? How did the white dominant culture system change? How did the racist system become less racist? That's what we should be looking for. And so it's not just about the individual, like that person said or did something racist, like just because you got that person coaching, right, or sent them to the training, that hasn't actually changed the system. And so we have to do a both and with that, right? We support people individually, we support people collectively, and we change the system. And so all those three things need to be happening at the same time.
So, I'm kind of a formula kind of girl, as you know me about that. Like, I like the steps. I like the clarity. So let's just play it out. If someone would have said something in a meeting and you're planning PD that wasn't supporting anti-racist work, or worse yet, even was racist, back to Isellas' point about saying something about a particular subgroup or speaker or person, let's talk about what could people say in that moment, or do they not say it in the moment, get it together and come back on one-on-one? What are some guidelines there?
Let's thinking about our use of language. And so, Christy, when you say subgroup, who are you referring to? And who's the main group?
I don't know did I just say sub? I think what I was trying to say was, if there was a group that they had said we can't talk about, that Oh no, what I meant was the whole group that was at the meeting versus should I pull out just the people who said it? That's what I think I meant.
Okay.
Okay. I don't know. There's so much banging that I'm having a little trouble, but I think I meant I didn't want to blame and shame. So should I do it the whole group, or should I do a smaller group, or just have a conversation with the one person who said it?
So I think like I would say something about, because it's usually around language and it's usually around using stereotypes. And so a lot of times I will bring it up in the whole meeting and not necessarily name that person. And I will always preface like, oh, something that I'm noticing is that we're using stereotypical or derogatory language when we're talking about people of color, when we're talking about Black people, when we're talking about Black children, when we're talking about Black teachers, when we're talking about other teachers. And so usually I just address that language and say that like that's something that is not just one individual that uses that language, like that's the language that you hear a lot. And so if our assumptions, if I'm going to name the assumption that I see is happening, that's what I'm going to name in the group and ask us to be mindful about that. And here's some other language that we can use, right? And so one of the things that come up is that when we try to do like catch-all language, like when we talk about minorities, and so like who minority to who? Because actually people of color are a global majority. And so if you're going to talk about Black people, if you're going to talk about Mexican American, you're going to talk about Filipino, like name who you're actually talking about and not just use catch-all terms like minority. And name white and name the whiteness. And so if we're talking about the majority group, like say white people. And so in our conversation and thinking about how we talk with each other, how we use language. And so like people won't know that because it's just part of our society of how we talk about the racial hierarchy, but not talk about it. And it's, well, that's just what we say to be polite, but it's actually not accurate. And you're actually avoiding talking about race when you should be naming race. Is that helpful? Does that make sense? It makes sense in my head.
Yeah. So one of the things that when I'm right in the middle of something, for me, it's about context. It's also about what I'm like. Ijuma's going out and she's speaking specifically about race and equity. And, if I'm showing up talking about infant toddler play and the cause and effect and all of the things that we do with infant tots. And so in that moment, I may not address it. But as we move on, I might circle back and in a fluid way, talk about being mindful of the language we use, the approach that we take because of these reasons. So sometimes I do that, especially if I don't know the folks. If this is a one-shot deal, I'm there for X amount of time, I'm going to circle back and do it in that kind of way. But there are many times when I do just simply say something like this. I actually use the term reframe. I'll say, I'm going to lean in a little bit right there, and I'm going to reframe that because this is what I heard, and I'm not. So let's talk. Can we talk about what your intent was with that? And then we work through the language a little bit more. And it depends for me. It's all intuitive. It depends to me how like the depth and then the not depth. And it's like someone just says something flippantly or someone says, it's like all of that comes into play for me.
Mm-hmm. And I think that like I do infant toddler workshops. Like there's no work that's outside my racialized identity, right? And so it's gonna come up. And people are gonna have questions about it. People are going to talk about, I had one experience, like I'm trying not to give a call to like name somebody. I was about to say their name. But we were talking about some things that we are going to do in the infant classroom, and someone named the child, let's say Harry, and they were like, Harry, that mulatto child, right? And so like people are like just oh yeah, and I'm like, oh, I have a question. And so like we had a conversation, and I talked about like the history of that word, and what came out of that was that that there's current literature that that uses that term, and in in the last like 3 years, like there's a and talks about identity and uses that language. And so I talked with that group about how that's not like that's a derogatory term. And one of the things as infantile teachers that we're beginning to support children's racial identity and development. And so it's important that we use accurate language when describing them in their, when we're with them and when we're not with them. And so like you're not gonna, call a Chinese child a derogatory term. You're not, so we have to be mindful of that language and not try to like excuse it of like just of course she was like, well, I didn't mean anything about it. I was like, I know you didn't. But here's the impact of using language like that. Here's the impact of not using accurate language with infants and toddlers. When language is really important, like they're taking a lot of stuff in and building their understanding. And so it's our responsibility to not use language that's gonna make them feel less than. That we want to use language that supports who they are and the brilliance of who they are and their racial and cultural identity.
In that moment, absolutely, I would have said something, but that's also a trigger of mine. And I'm very well aware of that because my family would call my child a mixed breed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that was fun conversations in our home.
Right.
Yeah.
And so like doing this work, I think that it's just in my practice to say it and to do it. And it takes practice. And it is all of our responsibility to speak out about it when it's happening. And we choose, because I will also add about like the context and being safe, right? Because you might be in a situation that if you say something in the meeting, you might be called in the office and fired. Right. And you might, that. So maybe you need another strategy. But that doesn't mean you don't say it, right? Just because you don't do it exactly as I would do it doesn't mean that you don't do it. So I just want to be clear about that.
Yeah.
So we've been, we posted about person first versus identity first. And I'm just reflecting right now, like how interesting and how taboo racism is in the white dominant culture. Because I'm so much more comfortable talking about person first and identity first, even though I have an able identity and I don't think second about talking about it. But when it comes to racism, I even think about, like we said this the other day, Ijuma, you introduce yourself sometimes as African-American, sometimes as Black, sometimes as both. Isellas, sometimes you do that as well. So I know, like, from white people, I bet you, this is a broad statement, but I would bet most people would say it's politically correct to say African-American. It's not right to say Black because we have negative connotations with the word. So we're just perpetuating that. So is it similar that we listen for how people name it their own identities, or do we pay attention to how language evolves over time and trends? How do we navigate those words that start to have really clear negative, harmful, and others that I would bet the white people feel have a negative connotation? Does that make sense? It was convoluted.
Yeah, I think that one is that you do both, right? Like I get self-determination to name who I am racially, right? And I tell you who I am racially and what language to use, right? That's my gift to you. Because I know like how white people are, right? And so if I tell you, then like there's no need to discuss. Like I don't go into a long, well, here's why I do it. Like I already told you, and we're moving on because we got other things to talk about, right? And so if you're still confused, then maybe you have a conversation with me later about that you're not sure about what to do. And so, and then I'm going to say, but if I tell you, what's the confusion about? Because usually the confusion is about your own comfort, because you don't want to make a mistake. You don't want to be out there and call someone the wrong race, and then they say that you're racist. And that's like not my responsibility to do the front work about
that's
that.
exactly what I wanted you to say, because that's what it is. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what that's about. So if people tell you what their race is and how to talk about their race, then use that.
Yep.
And then the next person you encounter, right?
Right.
You do the same thing. That's the work that we do. That's the work that's your responsibility to do, especially as a white person.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's hard, because as white, because you're the dominant norm, you don't ever have to think about that.
Well, remember in class, we
Uh-huh.
said, you asked us to say our race, and I said to Juma, I bet most of the white people weren't sure what to say.
Yeah. But and so here's the practice. Like that's one of the reasons why I asked, right? Because you need to be in practice of naming your race and understanding that you have a racialized identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
And as a person, I've done a lot of tribal work. And one of the things early on, when I was first just introduced to anti-bias approaches, like it was just the very beginning, there were all these generalized statements, right, that was kind of tossed around. And so one of the practices I would get into as I worked in different tribes in the western part of the United States was, how individuals and then as a group identified themselves. Because there's this whole thing of Native Americans, but they were like, we're Indians. I mean, there were some tribes who were like, we want to be called Indians. Mm-hmm. And so wherever I went, it's like, what do I need to know to ensure that I'm approaching this in a way that's respectfully responsive to the community, to your community? Yes. And that was like the first thing I did, because each one was so uniquely different. Mm-hmm. And the individuals within the community. So it wasn't just this global idea of this is what it means for this tribe. It was just each individual within that, how they perceive their community. We had to do that on the front end of all of our PDs.
Absolutely.
Because I'm coming in as an outsider. I don't know nothing about it. And I'm honest about that. And if there's something that I'm saying that it goes against your cultural values and your beliefs, then you need to let me know. Because I'm going to come in and I might talk about certain animals or certain things or certain approaches or whatever that may be offensive. And so help me. And this is where the reciprocity comes into play, right? And this is where the community comes into play.
Right. Because I usually say, like I was brought here to talk about this. And also I know that like I don't understand and I don't know all the cultural context. And so I do need us to be in reciprocal relationship, that I bring, what I know and understand. And then we start to talk about how does that make sense in your own cultural context. So from how you name yourself, because everyone doesn't have, like when people think about their racial or cultural identity, a lot of people don't have an individual, they say I'm part of, like they have a collective cultural and racial identity, right? And so like that language is different. And so you ask and you be humble, right? That is where the humility, like you be humble, that you don't come in thinking that you know all the things I need to know, even if you were briefed before. A lot of times I say, they brought me in and then they briefed me and this is what they said. And I know that probably isn't very accurate and probably isn't very helpful. So I would love for us to have a relationship that I can learn and be as supportive as I can. Mm-hmm. And that always works.
Yep.
And people are like, yes, because they've spent years and generations of people coming in being the savior and being the know-it-all and telling them about their culture and what they should be doing.
Yeah, and sometimes, working past that requires to be humble, right? And it also requires, not taking it personal is a really big thing, and also be willing to be reflective of
Yep.
your own biases, beliefs, perspectives, right? And so it really lends itself as such an incredible transformative experience when you allow that to happen.
And it's for you to do the work, right? It's not on them to do the work. It's always on you to do the work.
Yep.
And hope that you can have the gift of them supporting you in doing the work.
Yep.
Because I say this all the time, especially now in Black history, like, Black people do not exist for the education and enjoyment of white people or other people. And when we share that, like, it always is a gift. When someone says that, hey, you said something racist, it's always because they care about you and want to be in relationship with you. Right? Because if I didn't, I wouldn't say. I wouldn't question. I would just move on. Like, and I want to live in a world where we all can be liberated and free. So I'm going to push back and work to dismantle our racist systems.
And I think I'm just going to speak for myself. I think what's so unfortunate is that all of those things about being right and being uncomfortable and feeling like I'm going to be shamed or kicked off the island keep me from hearing that what you're doing is out of love, because I just go so quickly to, I was wrong and I have to defend myself. And it's just so flippin' unfortunate. I can even just, I think it's just.
Did she freeze?
I think so.
Okay, there you go.
I got like 5 pages of notes. I got to go back. What's our takeaway, my friends? What's our takeaway here?
You tell us.
Yeah. So my takeaway is just right what I was saying. Like, I have to stop thinking I've got to get it right. And I've got to stay committed to being anti-racist. I need to get some scripts like Isella often talks about, just so I have something ready. I appreciate what you said, Isella, about like, I want to reframe this. I want to learn more. Even Ijuma, when you were talking about like the legislature, it's like I don't ask for understanding. I just feel defensive or I feel mad about what was said. And then I just kind of like go, and I need to take the breath. I need to, so like for me, I want to do some work reflecting back on the couple of scenarios that are in my head and not criticize it or judge it, how I felt, how I dealt with it, but think about how I can deal with it going forward. That's my takeaway.
Is someone going next?
Do you have a takeaway, Stella?
My takeaway is that this work, what's interesting is I've come upon this new perspective of hard, the idea of it being hard. And what I've learned is that when I let go of the attachment that something is hard, then it's not as hard. Does that make sense? That my perception of it being hard work is what makes it so. And so what I've come to understand is that it's simply the work that needs to be done. And that's it. Just coming from a very neutralized statement of that this just a part of dismantling the system is being that which dismantles the system. And so it just is. And so instead of it looking at as so daunting or overwhelming, which very easily it can be, and it can feel, and I think that's what silences us sometimes, because it does feel so daunting, or so like, I'm in a group of 40 white folks. Are they going to walk away with a different perspective? And so then you kind of go, well, forget it. I'm just going to sit back and have my coffee. And so it's like, what part of this am I going to be in the dismantling of the system, and be very clear about that? And but I, coming from a more neutralized perspective of it just is, as opposed to, it's such a big thing. And so it's just a nice reminder for me of the important work that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think a lot of times I remind people, like, you can't wait until it feels easier, because a lot of people never actually get to that place. Like, it's always, some people is like, it's always hard. Like, it's hard when you have to talk to your boss or talk to your coworker, or like if, someone says something at, your holiday dinner, right? Like, a lot of people never get to that easy place, and you can't wait for the easy place.
Right.
Right. It's just the work, like Isellas said, it's just the work that needs to be done. But also, like, you don't have to suffer. That's the other place of coming back into being in community, right?
Yep.
Because that's where the place that you can find safety and joy and comfort, right? That's where you can enjoy yourself. Because a lot of times racist stuff happen is really ridiculous, right? Because you gotta laugh at it first, like, really? Right? And so if you're feeling like overwhelmed, that means that you're not actually tapping into your community, that you're trying to take it on. You see it as an individual thing. You're trying to take it all on yourself, right? You're overwhelmed like this big system. Like, it was never meant for you to take it down. Like, you don't have to be the hero. You don't have to take it down by yourself. Like, be in community, seek out support, seek out mentorship, right? Just don't sign up for the class and just sit back and listen, right? Like, use that as a catalyst of forming more community, being part of groups that are doing the work. And I think, like, that's my takeaway.
Thanks, you guys. This is important stuff to be talking about and thinking about from all kinds of angles and situations and perspectives. So thank you. All right, that's a wrap.
Awesome.
That's a wrap.